So, Stephen, talk to us. We've gone through all the, what is, but what's your definition of steampunk? That's why you're here to talk to us about your expertise.
Yeah, well, I have a fairly expansive view of it. One point that needs to be made is there's not like some council of steampunk elders that determines what is or is not steampunk. It's a very grassroots phenomenon, a grassroots community, and everybody has their own definition. It's kind of like science fiction. If you think about it, it's really hard to define science fiction. It's not fiction about science. It's not even necessarily fiction about the future, but you kind of know it when you see it. And steampunk is like that, but it's also somewhat in the eye of the beholder. There's an academic, an English professor in Canada named Mike Pershawn, actually wrote his PhD dissertation on trying to define steampunk, like what is steampunk. It was 300 pages long. Now he boiled that down to a blog post, and he boiled that blog post down to one sentence, and I will read you the sentence. And he calls it not so much a genre, but an aesthetic. And so he said, steampunk is an aesthetic that mixes three features: techno-fantasy, hyper-vintage, and retro-futurism. Now, that raises the question, well, what do you mean by techno-fantasy, hyper-vintage, and retro-futurism? Which is why
Right, absolutely.
Which is why it takes 300 pages to really, give it justice. But I think that's a pretty good definition. Other people have other definitions. I think it's helpful to maybe give a little history. As you mentioned, there were these three writers in Orange County who kind of got it started. And back then, it was science fiction set in the Victorian era. But since then, it has evolved and changed so much that does not really fit anymore. And I also would say it's probably not too helpful to get really hung up on the word steampunk. Steampunk was when K.W. Jeter came up with the name, he wasn't really intending to give it a formal label. It was almost like an off-the-cuff remark in a letter.